So, no, we definitely asked all of the speakers to cram like way too much into too little time. But I figured part of this was just to help warm all of you up to get you to see kind of all the real kind of production applications out there of blockchain technology and kind of the domains that we are thinking about and should be thinking about. Actually, why don't we take a seat? So what I thought I'd do just to kind of round out what we thought we'd do to round out the keynote session this morning is try to make it clear it's not just about the suits, not just about the nerds. It's also about the impact that these technologies can have on, the way I put it, was solving societal scale problems. Because for a lot of these deployments, they're not just a single vendor, it's not just one single use case, it's actually going in and building these things for communities. Communities that have commercial organizations operating in them, but in almost every setting are about either increasing the auditability or the way to validate against kind of corruption in these systems. And almost inevitably, that means involving government organizations, means involving civil society actors. And in fact, in many of those domains, there's actually unique problems that can be solved with blockchain technology in these kind of, I mean, a new kind of angle, if you will, on public-private partnerships. And so we sprinkled throughout the agenda for the next few days, a bunch of different panels and presentations, and I wanted to highlight for you a couple of those just to kind of encourage you to attend them and to be thinking about this as you listen to all of your talks. And so to help make that case, I wanted to bring up Matthew and Rose. Let me give kind of a brief just kind of background on each of them. Rose works with leading international organizations, Rose Shuman, sorry. Rose works with leading international organizations to assess and mainstream new innovations and technologies as founding partner of BrightFront Group, as well as founder and CEO of Question Box, an international nonprofit. Rose collaborates with clients and partners such as UNICEF, the World Bank, UN Global Pulse, the UN Secretary General's Office, the European Union, and the European Commission, as well as large foundations like Rockefeller and Hewlett, and leading multinational companies. Matthew Davie, is managing director at Kiva. Kiva being kind of the original peer-to-peer lending NGO, but micro business as well, and is the lead staff member on technologies for financial inclusion. He is a charter member of Hyperledger Social Impact Working Group and is in the ID 2020 ecosystem. Very cool. Advisory Steering Committee. Additionally, Matthew is managing partner at Davie, a technology incubator and advisory firm specializing in emerging markets and technologies. And Rose will be moderating two panels later today on social impact applications and government applications. And Matthew will be talking about a project that Kiva is doing. But to kind of give a preview, Rose, I thought I'd ask you, why should this audience care? I mean, I know there's folks out there in government for sure, but most of the audience here are going to be developers or businesses in this space. What are the kinds of use cases that you see emerging in the public sector that you think really will touch a large number of constituents out there and are worth kind of like highlighting for the crowd?
Sure. Anyway, thanks, Brian, and
Sure.
Great to be up here. And hello, everybody. So, almost every person in the world is subject to a government. Government is the ultimate arbiter of truth for whether you exist, whether you own anything, as well as your rights to healthcare, to education, as well as a whole other bunch of processes, including how you can run your businesses. So it's very, very, very important that a government have a version of truth that is trustworthy. And in a lot of the world, so I'm excited to be moderating two panels. So one is government writ large, and one is about Global South specifically. And one of the things that's really exciting about blockchain and why everybody should care is that blockchain excites me personally in that government and corruption sometimes go together. And one of the main, I think, excitements around blockchain is that this could be a technique to lower the leverage of corruption. And when you have a single point entity that is not a commercial entity that can determine truth within the bounds of any country and sometimes beyond the bounds of country, for example, the UN, it's really, really important that there could be some equitable way to decide what is correct. And I think we might all care about that.
Yeah, and in particular, organizations like the ones that were mentioned, like Rockefeller or Hewlett or the UN, like what is their level of understanding now about blockchain technology, and what do you think they struggle with? Like, what would help get some of the projects they're thinking of like further along in being deployed?
Sure. Okay, so that's a great question. I think in any organization, particularly non-commercial ones, that would be government as well as the social good sector, which can be foundations, could be UN, you have a real mix of people. I think there's generally a struggle to get very, very high quality technical people. There's obviously some superstars and champions throughout, but because they're non-commercial entities, they seem to be a little bit less geared to being able to evaluate technical talent. So in these cases, the key is really being able to communicate. And I think that the level of communication, the clarity, the use cases, and understanding what they get, as well as reducing the fear and the perception of risk around it is very important. I mean, across all different use cases. The drivers and the goals that foundations in the UN are trying to serve include pretty much everything that's good for humanity that you could imagine. Food and water and shelter and safety, having an identity, and all of these things can be promoted through uses of blockchain partnerships. And what's interesting about these sort of sectors is, I won't say even more than business, but because so much of the world is operated by commercial and for-profit entities, the UN and governments and foundations have to work with others. They're inherently a multi-party, partnership-oriented entity that understand that they don't actually often do the implementation work on the ground, which a business might do or a nonprofit might do. So I think that in terms of mental model readiness, they're actually farther along than those who think they might be able to go it alone. I think it's also very important to understand that these folks, some of them at least, make the rules that we all operate in and the environments that we work in. And so involving them in discussions with, I think, very clear types of explanations that are very layman geared is a really important moment right now, because there's excitement, there's interest, and there's a fair bit of confusion. So there's a great opportunity actually to guide them in any of all of these use cases.
And so, some of the root functionality in so many of these use cases have to do with identity. And I thought, Matthew, if you could give us just a little kind of preview of the talk, but really, what is kind of Kiva's interest in blockchain technology in general, but specifically in kind of the identity side of this story?
Yeah, maybe for context, for those who don't know Kiva, I'll just give you the quick 10 seconds, which is kind of the original microfinance peer-to-peer lending crowdfunding platform. And over the past 13 years, we've loaned out $1.3 billion to 2.5 million unbanked customers in 85 countries around the world, a lot of times displaced populations and refugees. So to your question about identity and why do we care about blockchain or DLT, what's really interesting when you work on the ground in the unbanked world or with vulnerable populations is you realize that actually the system is just broken for them. It's actually nothing, they are creditworthy by and large. They have a form of identity, it's just not one that we can use as you move up to the developed world. And there's a lot of actors, a lot of these relief organizations, a lot of microfinance institutions who already work there, and others who would like to work there. And so the reason we care a lot about identity and decentralized identity is the data that exists today is all proprietary in these silos. And the first step towards being able to bring more products and services and bring more inclusion, financial and otherwise, to these vulnerable populations is not to say blow everything up and start from scratch. It's to say if we could just federate the data that exists today, it would be much more robust and much more trustable. And the only way we're going to be able to stitch this data together is if all these different institutions with their proprietary IDs can have those IDs somehow reliably mapped together. Because we're not going to be able to go out at scale and make sure that a government ID gets into everybody's hands. But we could get all these institutions to start taking their current identity and extending it to a decentralized identity that then, whether it's Hyperledger Indy or the W3C standards around DIDs that are kind of behind that, provide a platform or a mechanism for stitching that together. And that's why we get really excited, because we see data from 500 plus MFI partners in 85 countries. We know the data exists, and we see like a very thin slice of putting it together. And man, if we could just stitch that together for the 10,000 microfinance institutions, we might be in a position to say, hey, HSBC, here's how you drop $100 million into sub-Saharan Africa for financial inclusion.
And you recently announced a project with the government of Sierra Leone. Again, not to steal too much of the thunder.
Taking all my thunder.
That involves some specific technology choices in that announcement. What is it that you need? Well, let me ask it this way: what is it that you saw in the Hyperledger technologies that allowed you to go, okay, now it's time to make a bet on this specific platform? And what do you need from the community to be able to help make sure that when you go and make a promise to the government of Sierra Leone, that you'd be able to, that'll actually work for them, that'll follow up for them?
Yeah, I should mention this is the government of Sierra Leone plus 2 United Nations agencies, the UNDP, which does kind of elections and identity, and then UNCDF, which helps with financial sector development. What is it with Hyperledger Indy for identity, to zoom in on identity again? A lot of it comes down to 2 things when we think about technology choices. One is it needs to be free or near free to implement. And so cryptocurrencies, anything with a currency pegged to it, started to get difficult for us because we're talking about people who might be taking out $2 mobile money loans or getting $10 delivered in cash by someone on the back of a scooter. And so one thing was being able to operate in a permission system, or at least in one where you don't have to have it be pegged to a currency that might be volatile, is very important at the bottom of the pyramid because cost is a big concern. The second one is when we go to co-opt with United Nations agencies and with governments, it's very important to be working with open source code. And there's many, many reasons for that. The primary reason is political. When you're going to get these governments to sign up, they don't want to, nor should they really want to, box themselves into a proprietary solution that they don't own. And so the fact that all of this comes out of the open source community and has all of the unit economics, but also all of the support of the open source community, is really important to be able to even start a discussion about implementing tech. Yeah.
And Rose, kind of playing off that, what are the ways for open source developers and for kind of startups in this space to engage with government and civil society actors and NGOs on helping to build some of these solutions? Is there something unique about blockchain technology in this space, or are there other patterns from other technology movements like open data and that sort of thing we can learn from?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it is actually following in a pattern. I mean, there's been many, many waves of different innovations and technologies that have transformed government and the social goods space and sector. So they're actually primed and ready and realize that they have to track it. So actually, it may be a surprise, but government and international organizations like UN entities are very aware of blockchain. They're aware of artificial intelligence. They're eager, and most of them have innovation laboratories. So there's this huge entire world of innovation labs, of pilot projects that are radical innovation funds. For example, I'm an advisor to the UN Secretary General's Innovation Fund, and this is an internal fund across the United Nations of agencies pairing up and having to do new novel work in a bunch of different topics that are actually very cutting edge, one of which includes financial and the other one is data. So they're quite aware and eager to be part of the mainstream in the center and ahead of the curve. In terms of how to engage with them, so I think that there's the original entry point would probably be through their innovation departments, because there's these outliers, these mavericks, who are really working to discover within entities and organizations what can be done when it's the art of the possible. And they're very, very collaborative. There's also, I think, going through the route of finding larger entities such as Kiva, as well as some other bigger groups that already have very strong established relationships in the sector, and looking how to work through with them. So essentially in a kind of subcontractor type of relationship, just because procurement in governments is a miserable mess. I think that having blockchains involved will make procurement a bit better, but it's very difficult. But I would look for those margin players, the innovation areas, as well as ones who have existing relationships, and identify those and become their partners.
That's great. Well, and so many of these government blockchain pilots that we're starting to see out there in identity and procurement in other domains are definitely collaborations with the private sector. And a lot of them are talking about open source software as a means to get there more quickly, more equitably, to help get some competition going between service providers to governments, which is always good. But it's really been encouraging. I was worried that the word blockchain would scare off a lot of governments from looking at, Hyperledger technologies in particular as solutions to some of these problems, but I think we're rising above the noise on that front, and it's thanks to work such as yours and to many of you out there for making these technologies real. So we're over time, so I do want to thank the two of you, and I'll just end with a couple of closing notes. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks. We can all shake. Okay.
Don't forget to download the Socio app, which is a great way to connect with other people at the conference here. Especially look for people that you don't yet know, people who are working on things that you don't know enough about. Go and approach them. I mean, we're not a 30,000 person event. We're 700 people, which is just 1 or 2 larger than, what was it, Dunbar's number, right? 2x larger, or 3x larger. So get to know people here. Again, people are what's essential behind these technologies, and so make that really real, and the Socio app is a great way to kind of reach others to do that. There are coffee and snacks out in the sponsor showcase now for this break, so feel free to help yourselves. Later tonight at 5:30, there's a booth crawl, again in the sponsor showcase forum. And then following the booth crawl, we'll have an all-attendee party happening tonight at a place called the Pantheon, Basel. Buses will depart from here beginning at 6:30 outside the entrance to the Congress Center, and they'll run continuously back and forth until 10 p.m. tonight. And then finally, keynotes will be starting again tomorrow here at 10 a.m. with Leanne Kemp from Everledger, with Bruce Schneier, the noted cybersecurity expert, kind of giving us his take on cybersecurity in the blockchain space, and with Dan Middleton from Intel, talking about kind of really what we've accomplished technologically within the Hyperledger community this year. So see all of you throughout the rest of today. Thank you.